Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with Barney Sargent Megicks. Barney, welcome to the show.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me on.
Really looking forward to unpacking all things talent development environments with you. Before we get on to that, tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm currently a PhD student at Leeds Beckett University, third and final year. I work full-time on that. That's my daily project. And I also work for ICOACHKIDS as well. So kind of my day-to-day work is research for my PhD, which feeds into the ICOACHKIDS project as well.
You coach? You're a hockey coach?
Yeah, so when I'm not doing PhD project work, I spend most of my time down at the hockey pitch coaching at club, county and regional academy level as well.
Did you play the game?
I do still play a little bit, when I'm not injured.
When you're not injured, are you quite injury prone?
I've gone through 2 years now of a few concussion and hamstrings and that sort of thing.
No.
But I'm pretty much back to it now. But that's the coaching side of me, which keeps me involved, which is good.
Nice. What got you interested in talent development pathways and talent development environments?
Yeah, so I think my angle into talent development environment to this stuff is it's mainly through holistic development. Like that's where my interest came from. So I trained after university, I trained as a PE teacher, and that was something that really interested me. So kind of how you develop people in different ways, people development, personal development, how that all relates to kind of sport and performance development as well. So that was my way into the PhD, which was kind of an advertised role within like holistic development within talent development environments. So that's kind of my first angle in really, and that's how I started to kind of work into the talent development space.
And you've been involved in one enormous project, haven't you?
So it was the first study. Yeah, it's the first study of the PhD, first big study of the project as well. It was a big project. We started it in late 2020. Just published it a couple of weeks ago. So it's been brewing.
That project being examining European talent development environments?
Yeah, so it was essentially like a big macro study of European talent development environments across 3 different stakeholders. So examining perceptions of quality for the 3 different stakeholder groups, which is athletes, parents, and coaches, across 5 countries and 27 sports.
Okay.
So it's really planned as this like what's going on, what's the state of the talent development landscape, essentially, what's going on out there. Let's go as big and as broad as we can and ask these different groups what they think of their environment.
And this is a study you conducted with a number of co-researchers: Kevin Till, Feek Rungan, Ian Coburn, Adam Gledhill, Thomas Mitchell, Stacey Emmons, and Sergio Lara Bercial. So quite a big joint project.
Yeah, it's a serious team there.
Yes,
serious team.
Yeah, well, we've hosted Sergio on the Sports Psych Show before. Is he your direct supervisor?
He's my main one, and then I also have Kev and Fika as well. And then the rest of that team kind of work within the same sort of research space and feed into the ICOACHKIDS project as well. So that's how we kind of work together.
So let's start unpacking this. I listened to what you said there. You spoke about the project being related to examining the perceptions that athletes, parents, and coaches have of the environments they're embedded into. Would I be correct there? And if so, why are those perceptions so important?
So the project examines essentially how they perceive their environment, so how good they see it is.
Okay.
Over different areas of their environment.
Yeah.
And it gives us an indication. It gives you an indication of like how they think and feel, experience that environment. So the project, the tool we use examined 5 different areas of the environment. So we're able to look at kind of so it's long-term development, communication, holistic quality preparation, alignment of expectations, and support network. So those are kind of the known 5 areas that make up a good talent development environment from research. So we're able to examine how those different groups think, feel, perceive essentially the quality of their program across those different 5 areas. And that gives a pretty powerful view of those different environments, really.
Can we unpack those 5 environmental features a little bit more, because they feel like they're important?
Yeah, it's worth going through this before we dive into the deeper bit of the the paper, really.
Yeah.
So the way we looked at the environments is across these 5 different areas. So the 5 areas represent what the research tells us is a good quality environment. So long-term development. Okay, we're thinking a talent development environment here as well, right? So long-term development, holistic quality preparation, which isn't as self-explanatory. So that's to do with how a program develops an athlete in and outside their environment, or for inside outside their environment. The support network, so that surrounding support network that an athlete has. Mm-hmm. The communication with stakeholders in that environment, and finally alignment of expectations, which is to do with how coherently people in that environment are to kind of sporting goals, things like goal setting, individualized goals as well, and that sort of thing. So those are the 5 areas that you using. It's called the Talent Development Environment Questionnaire.
Okay,
we can assess an environment, basically.
So you gave all participants this questionnaire. There were coaches, parents, players across 27 sports. Mm-hmm. You had, let's have a look here, 571 athletes, 759 parents, 134 coaches. That's a huge sample.
Yeah, I mean, to our knowledge, it's the largest TDE study to date, particularly taking the 3 groups. There's other studies that have done quite big athlete groups, but over the 3 groups, it's the biggest. And you kind of get that triangulation as well between the 3 perspectives. So hopefully getting quite a good macro view of what's going on across TDEs. I guess it's worth noting that we're like the whole ICOACHKIDS project is a partnership between organisations. So we're able to use all the gatekeepers, all the kind of organisations across Europe to support the project.
Right.
So these kind of different organisations that make up ICOACHKIDS were providing access across the 5 different countries.
Yeah.
And then we're able to get kind of really broad different sports there as well.
So what did you find? What did the results tell you?
Okay, so there's two main pockets of looking at the ways of looking at this, right? Which is firstly how the group together viewed their environment, and then secondly is how did the different stakeholders, so athlete, parents, and coaches, view their environment differently. Okay, which is probably arguably the bit more juicy bit of the study. We'll cover the first bit first, maybe.
Yeah.
So overall, kind of all groups had generally positive perceptions of their environment. The way we looked at it, it's you kind of assessed it on the 1 to 6 Likert scale. Overall, generally perceptions were reasonably positive, and that wasn't a particularly unique finding, but it's somewhat promising that across Europe that's the finding. And then we had kind of how we might see those 5 different areas rated, basically, and then kind of what they might need. So overall, long-term development was the highest rated area of their environment across the 3 different groups. So that's things like long-term planning, kind of a process-driven approach, not an overemphasis of results, that sort of thing, creating a kind of long-term development focus. So that's the highest rated area. And then the lowest rated area, jumped straight to that, was support network. And this it was all to do with kind of the amount of and access to multidisciplinary staff. That was the lowest rated part of the environment across the 3 groups as well.
How interesting. So were you able to ascertain any more information on that data? Did you have anything further in terms of reasons behind perceptions at all, or was it just the perceptions, just the basic data that you actually attained?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, Dan. So we're measuring these 5 areas with statements, right? So in some of these sections, there's 5 statements. We can only measure their perceptions. We don't understand why they have these perceptions and kind of the details behind that. For example, the highest rated item, so the statement that all 3 groups rated the highest was, my training is specifically designed to help them develop effectively in the long term. So we can kind of understand the rating of that, but we don't know much more beneath that that's why we do more detailed or qualitative research, really. And that's the benefit of the pros and cons. This is a big we're throwing the net far and wide here, so we don't get as much detail. We've got the breadth. But kind of one other finding, I suppose, is quite interesting to look at is the one that relates to holistic development, which is the HQP.
Yeah.
So that subscale kind of relates to things like concern for well-being, life outside of sport, training competition balance.
Right.
And like what was really interesting here is that quite a lot of research before we did the study was pointing towards this being like one of the lower ranked areas, like the relatively low part of TDEs across kind of the research that was done, like Irish hockey, English football, Australian rugby league, for example. This is all low. It was it's kind of a bit of a pattern here that like looks like this is an area that seems to be perceived somewhat low in TDEs across research.
Okay.
So like going into that was kind of like an interesting hypothesis to like us kind of explore in more detail, like considering we were going across lots of environments. What's the big picture here? And we didn't find it to be relatively low. We found it as the middle rated of the five. So that was kind of interesting finding, somewhat promising as well. But we'll come on to kind of the details behind that, which is when we compare the three different groups, which is an interesting finding there as well.
Well, let's do that.
So that second kind of main pocket of research, right, is how the three groups rated their environments differently. So like that's kind of, to me, that's kind of quite juicy. Just like, okay, so if you ask someone about a talent, an academy, let's say, who do you think rates their environment highest? Athletes, parents, or coaches? And that was like when we got the results through, that was a discussion we had as a research team. It was like, who do you think rated their environment highest or lowest, for example? That's quite interesting, isn't it? Because like the three, that triad, how does that fall? So coaches had higher perceptions than athletes, and athletes had higher perceptions than parents. So we saw kind of this
higher positive.
Yeah, perceptions. So more positive perceptions.
Yeah.
So you kind of see like a sandwich of results here. So athletes in between their parents who are lower and their coaches who are higher. So the face value of that is like coaches see their environment rated more positively than athletes. Athletes see their environment rated more positively than their parents.
Any value judgment? Do you have any value judgment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's worth a discussion. Like, again, we don't like have the data like underneath that to tell us why, but it's certainly an interesting. Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion it makes up for like from a talent development perspective. Like, the argument for coaches having that higher perception, it almost makes sense, right? Like, I mean, arguably, it makes sense generally. You'd expect coaches to have some confidence in their processes. You compare that to athletes and coaches, then let's contextualize it. So,
yes,
coaches have knowledge of knowledge of talent development, the processes that underlie that. They have like a long-term view of the development process as well. So compare that to athletes and parents who might not have had detailed understanding of kind of the science behind why they're doing things. That makes sense, right? You also put in kind of that. You throw in the idea that talent development is a challenging process and is not always like a cognitively enjoyable thing for athletes sometimes. Yeah. Then that also makes some sense. Parents supporting the athletes there as well. Like a coach has a long-term view of that development process. So an athlete is going through a challenging period in their academy. Tough results, difficulty with some sort of technical thing they're working through, parents supporting that. That's just going to be perceived as more difficult. As a coach who sees the long-term benefit of that, potentially, that period is really rich for that athlete's development. Again, like that athlete might not see that as a totally positive experience, but that coach is rating that. Actually, that's maybe quite a good thing for them in the long term. So it kind of makes sense in that perspective, I think.
Do you think, therefore, even though this is only limited data, that those findings, the disparity between coach and player-parent perceptions, has implications for coach practice? And if so, what might they be?
Yes, cool. Yeah, so I think the second point of that finding is like, and we can't look beyond the differences in the ratings being coaches maybe thinking their environment is a stronger perception than athletes and coaches, athletes and parents, right?
Yeah.
So we term this like social desirability bias that
yes.
Kev Till talked about in another paper that was quite relevant to this.
Okay.
Which is like they have quite a strong perception of their environment. Maybe that reflects kind of their personal perspectives on how good they are and how good their practice is. And like I'm like conscious of taking that too far,
sure.
But I think there's a point. The point is like it definitely adds value to coach reflection, coach discussions amongst each other, and really, it's really important for like athlete and parent feedback input into the environment. So what are those channels that an athlete and parent has to provide, I guess, formal and informal feedback into the daily processes of what go on? So like seeing those stakeholders as assets, co-creators of their environment, from a practical point of view, I think is useful perspectives to really consider. So what are some of the practices that a coach is doing that enables the athlete to have a voice? And then what are some maybe the formal channels they have in that environment that are able that they can provide feedback to their coaches, or the parents can provide feedback as well. So I think it creates quite a strong case for that. Would be the main sort of practical takeaway from it, really.
What I'm hearing from you there is implications for communication, top down, bottom up communication. I love what you're saying in terms of potentially giving players and parents the opportunities, ways to feedback. It makes me think of the importance of giving them a platform, an opportunity to feedback on their experiences and their perceptions of what is being delivered and why it's being delivered. Not just how it's being delivered, but why it's being delivered. Coming back to your point on, experiencing that rocky road of talent development, experiencing roadblocks and speed bumps and, challenges, along the journey. I do wonder sometimes if from top down, as coaches, we don't communicate what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it, that why being important, then the perception that, say, players and parents can have can be negative, which can influence, the narrative and meaning of why they're doing what they're doing, and it can influence their learning ability.
Yeah, I think that's already fair. And for the results in the paper, we found that for that holistic development, the HQP area, there was significant differences between the three groups. That was the only area we found differences between the three groups. So parents were significantly lower than both athletes and coaches. So I guess that's quite interesting, because it's it's the intangible, the implicit, the psychosocial area where they had most disagreement. The most disagreement for the three groups was this area. And for that psychosocial thing, so that challenge, for that well-being support, that's really important you're aligned on that area. Not just because of the face value basic impact of that, but also you've got coaches making decisions around how much should I challenge an athlete. I'm seeing, I think my environment is of this quality, what's going on right now. I think we're doing these things really well. And I'm based off that information, I'm making a decision of maybe how much I push an athlete that day, how much I'm challenging an athlete, how much, and I might need to reach out to a parent to communicate with something with them. So that's really important. If I'm not gauging that right, like you said, Dan, that would be a concern or potentially a worry. It's just really important to be aligned on that area. And I think arguably more difficult because it's invisible, right? You're not seeing this go on. It's behind the scenes. It's everyday sort of intangible stuff.
And I think what you said at the end there is really important. It makes it very much a grey matter, doesn't it? It makes it, this is shades of grey, as to whether coaches actually communicate to parents and players about this and how they do it and how thoroughly they do it. And it makes it more challenging for coaches, doesn't it? The implication is that this is if there's an onus on coaches to communicate everything, the why of everything, then that's enormously onerous, isn't it? Enormously onerous, and perhaps counterintuitive at times, because they'll be doing things hidden away from view for reasons that perhaps parents and athletes don't need to know. Can you remind me of the psychosocial factors that are being measured here that are important within the study?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it kind of looks in this holistic quality preparation, which is things like coaches talking about player well-being to players, athletes. Can have an interest in life outside of sport, coaches talking about athletes with other coaches, helping develop mental toughness, helping me to plan for things when things go wrong, being taught to balance training, competition, recovery, those sorts of areas. So that's kind of what that area, that subscale sort of covers, really. So it's kind of quite broad, but it kind of fits in them. It's the main psychosocial area of the scale.
Yeah. Broad but vital.
Yeah, I think it's an area we would want to, like, given the results particularly, we want to dive into more and get more detail around and do some follow-up research into. Like that, one of the unique findings really of that study was the greatest difference between the stakeholders was in that one subscale. I think that's one area we would look at again.
And that's the area that parents and athletes rated lower?
Significantly lower than coaches, but also athletes rated it significantly lower than parents as well. That was a unique finding.
Because the interpretation of that is that the parents and athletes don't feel that their holistic needs are being catered for. Is that the interpretation, essentially?
Perhaps. I think it's more they see that as not as strong as coaches see it. But also, athletes were significantly higher than parents here as well, which is another interesting dynamic. So coaches and athletes were higher than parents. Athletes were higher than parents too.
Okay.
So it's not a simple kind of grouping them together there. It's a little bit more complex, yeah.
Any thoughts on why that could be the case?
So the parent perspective, yeah. So I mean, you think about a parent in that daily interactions of that triad and environment. Parents are more distal, right? So they're more distal generally. So they're not as closely related to what's going on. They don't always see stuff. They just get a perspective of what they see on the sidelines through the fence, from the viewing area, whatever it might be, right? And then you say, well, we're measuring psychosocial stuff here, which is implicit. So then, how does a parent see something like that going on and really understand how good it is? Now that's a hard thing, right? That makes some sense then. So yeah, that kind of helps explain it to some extent. But again, that's important, right? Because the result was important because parents need to know what's going on. Like a parent needs to know, like how, to the extent how good things are, like how an athlete feels about things, how coaches feel about things, so they can provide appropriate support, what that athlete can lean on them if they need to. If an athlete's finding things really hard, like that parent needs to either consolidate, or if they know what's going on, they can double down on things. Like that framing of challenge, for example, is important. Like a parent needs to know what's going on. So that's is an interesting finding too. But it generally relates to that visibility of what's going on and access to. So like the role is for that coach is like explain, talk, communicate, have open communication channels of what we're doing at the moment. This is a period of a challenge for the athlete. Let's have that as a communication channel. That's something we talk about.
It feels to me like out of this research project, one of the main messages might be that those channels of communication are absolutely essential. That in order to help athletes and parents have a positive perception of the talent development environment they're embedded into, that, yes, process needs to be as good, as effective as possible. But whether it's good or bad, effective or ineffective, the reality is those channels of communication have to be there in order for athletes and parents to feel comfortable within these environments. No question, mate, just a thought.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing, and on top of that as well, is working towards alignment in that environment as well. Like that communication leads to those different stakeholders working towards the same goals, being clear on their messages, practices while they're doing things and that sort of thing. And that definitely leads to a more effective talent development environment. And there's plenty of good work on there out there. Like you look at Jamie Taylor's work, for example, on that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that was the precise name I was thinking of. He came on the show to talk about both vertical and horizontal coherence. Essentially, everybody being on the same page. that, common sense suggests that that's important. In practice, enormously challenging. And it's enormously challenging because, people, human beings, have different needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, expectations, values, and so on and so forth, don't they? So it makes it a melting pot of complexity.
Yeah.
Again, no question, but it would be interesting to get. I'm sure you've thought a lot about this.
Yeah, it's an area that obviously the paper feeds into quite a lot. I think one of the main takeaways at the end of the paper was that we talked about is it seems hard, if not impossible, for all groups to be aligned. Really, that doesn't seem like a pragmatic solution to work towards. So how can programs build in some sort of slippage? We called it, which we brought another paper in from.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
So what are really strong goals, ethos, or values of a program that we all work towards? But what are some of the unique things maybe as a coach that make them unique, that they want to bring into that environment that allows them to do what they want to do? What's their bit of slippage, for example? And I think that happens almost more organically with athletes and parents, because that's not necessarily such an explicit thing. But I think there's a bit of kind of shaping the program around them and them having ownership over bits of the program too. It's a bit of like a give and take there, I think. Like, yes, we need that strong organizational core to us that people bind to, that binds our practice together as a group. We're all working towards this thing, and here's some of the practices that we follow as a coaching team to get there. But what are some of the things as a coaching team maybe that we want to have our own little bit of uniqueness on, that we're allowed to slip on, essentially?
So can you define slippage for me? What do you specifically mean by that?
I think we're talking about coach autonomy. Okay. So the ownership of that coach has over their practice and some of the unique things they bring to that environment. So we talk about kind of like, say, having a coherent sort of aligned practice as a coaching team, right? So here's some of the things that we all try and do. Where does a coach want slippage? They like to coach in that certain way because that's their style of coaching, and that's kind of recognized in the program, that these coaches like to do these sorts of things. So I'm having this kind of autonomy as a coach. I think that builds in some flexibility into that sort of that organizational core, really, where you're trying to be aligned, but you're just acknowledging that this is certain kind of ways that a coach likes to coach, like that slippage, I suppose.
Okay, interesting. So I'm interpreting that as an organization will have a specific process, a curriculum, if you like, a pathway in place, and a coach within that pathway. And please correct me if I'm not quite grasping this. A coach within that pathway would, by and large, stick to that curriculum or the norms of the pathway, but there can be some slippage in as much as coach can engage in certain ideas, principles, practices that might move away from what's deemed to be the organizational norm. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, pretty much there. Yeah. So it's pretty common for talent development environments to have kind of development frameworks or philosophies or mental models, let's say, as well, that guide and shape athlete development, so the way we want to develop athletes, and practice in that environment as well. So what are some kind of the agreed coaching processes or practices that we work towards? So if that's what we're trying to do, then let's layer in a bit of coach flexibility into that as well. So here's the goals of the program that we're really aiming towards. How can a coach be allowed a little bit of kind of opportunity to shape their bit of their program to afford them that kind of autonomy on their practice a little bit? And maybe that helps overcome this sort of desire for total agreement, which seems quite hard to get if we look at our data here, I think. But again, it's worth noting that this is all kind of discussion, debate off the back of the paper, where right at the end we kind of go through this, where we want to do more research on this as well, definitely.
Well, let's speak a little bit about where this research has gone, or where your research has gone after this initial huge project. So you grabbed hold of this data. What was next for you after that?
Well, it's part of this whole ICOACHKIDS Plus project, which is into holistic talent development environment. So this was the big quant survey that we started off with. And then following that, it was a bit more of a deep dive into holistic development, really. Firstly, trying to understand what are the challenges at play relevant to that, and what does holistic development actually mean? And can we be a little bit more concise and clear about that? And then working towards some good practice relating to holistic development.
Well, I know earlier in our conversation, you pretty much defined holistic development for us, but can you do that again with reference to sort of this next piece of research?
Yeah, this is a big project. This, to be honest, so this is the second study. So this is from 23 interviews, 6 talent development environments across the UK, 6 different sports, and a big literature review to get to the point where we were able to provide what we think is a way forward to define holistic development, a useful definition. Again, it's very much based off kind of the consensus statement from the IOC that was put forward in 2015.
The IOC?
Yeah, so the International Olympic Committee research group from there did a bit of a review that kind of looked at some of the challenges that athletes face in the current climate of talent development, athlete development. And put forward a bit of an agenda on the sort of topic around this, so that this quote is quite useful. It's quite useful to guide us. The goal is clear: develop healthy, capable and resilient young athletes while attaining widespread, inclusive, sustainable and enjoyable participation and success for all levels of individual athletic achievement. So the paper is kind of based around that, and that's kind of their leading statement. And look, it kind of sets a bit of an agenda for where talent development might need to look, and it recognises some of the challenges, right, that are at play. And that's what we do in this new guideline, creating holistic development environments guidelines report that we're working on. This executive summary that we've just published, which is kind of recognising 2 areas of concern that relates to that IOC report, which is kind of talent development is a place that is really time exhaustive, as well as financial as well, and that can result in kind of, we'll call it a sacrifice of social educational experiences of young people. So that's like one issue. Another problem being kind of it can be a really physically, socially challenging, demanding experience. So we can kind of see some negative health come from talent development. So we draw those things together, look at all the literature around talent development, also bringing in some life skill, PYD, health, well-being literature to get to this problem, and then try and use that to define what holistic talent development is, which is a definition or a concept that's been floating around for a long time. Obviously, it's kind of more grounded in PYD, life skills, PE too, but it's been floating around in talent development for a little bit too. But from our perspective, without a real clear goal of what it's trying to achieve. So we're hearing, kind of reading a lot around, we're doing holistic development because we want to develop people's social, tech, phys aspects. And then we're hearing some stuff around, well, we need to care for them outside of sport and their well-being and stuff. Okay, so these things, how do these sort of things relate and merge together? So the problem is these 2 things, right? Recognizing that IOC statement. So let's take that all together and let's work towards a coherent definition of holistic development, which we have kind of got to now, which we hope is going to be a useful way forward, which is the kind of overarching approach to athletic talent development that aims to develop young people in 3 interrelated domains. That is athletic skills, health and well-being, and life readiness. So that is a way of doing talent development. It doesn't get away from the fact we're trying to develop athletes here, which is important, right? Because we're not here to take away from that. It's how can we do that, recognizing some of the challenges at play, also recognizing the responsibilities an environment might have to develop athletes in other ways to overcome some of those challenges, basically. So that's kind of the definition now we're running with, really, which is the interaction of these 3 outcomes, these dimensions.
That's really interesting. I'm going to reflect back to what I've heard, because I just think this is so important.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So.
No, this is great, because you're striving to redefine what a talent development environment can look like. You're broadening the possibilities here. And you're really starting from the position, what I'm hearing you say is you're starting from the position that really you're posing two big problems here. Number one, hey, look, talent development can be it can eat up time. It can cause young people to sacrifice social and educational experiences. Problem. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is because of the physical, the psychological, and social demands of developing talent, the health and well-being of a young person can be impacted. So you're starting from that position. These are our two main concerns when it comes to talent development environments. And so what you're suggesting is let's stop being so narrow in terms of what a talent development environment is, which probably historically has been, let's say, in football, soccer, we develop football, soccer players here, footballers, soccer players here, or basketball, we develop basketball players, or we develop swimmers here. What you're saying is, hang on, let's broaden this in order to positively influence the experiences that young people and their parents have throughout the talent development pathway. So, three factors, three interrelated domains. We develop, in talent development pathways, we develop athletic skills, health and well-being, life readiness. Am I essentially hearing you correctly?
Yeah, nice summary. I think what's important as well. I was engaging, being in talent development environment, experience that is an amazing thing, and athletes deserve the opportunity to do that as well, right? It's not about taking away that as well, but it's just recognizing some of the challenges that come with that, and short and long term challenges as well. Like an athlete can have an amazing experience throughout their talent development pathway, but there's a long term impact to that as well that we should recognize too. So the challenge is, right, how do we create environments that support them to develop towards athletic success, also in some way supports health and well-being, life readiness, to try and mitigate some of the short and long-term challenges that come with that too. Because if you take out there's other types of environments that an athlete or a young person could go into to develop the health and well-being, the life readiness. All right. But this is what are the challenges that go on in talent development? And actually those things all need to marry up. And there's some push and pulls and some tensions and some doubling down, right, that happens between these three areas, which is why they kind of relate to each other too.
Now, I know you've brought together 6 principles of holistic development that talent development environments can incorporate. Be interesting to unpack those, run through those, talk a little bit about those. Let's begin at the beginning. Number 1, a holistic philosophy of athlete development. Yeah, talk to me a bit about these.
Yeah, let's talk through it then. So, in terms of number 1, you're not going to have a holistic talent development environment unless you plan to do it or want to do it. And the most simple point of view is that program needs to want to develop athletes in that way. And for a long time, I think, as you said earlier, successful, effective talent development environments has been defined as those who create athletes to make and perform at the elite level, right? So actually, we need to kind of move away from a little bit. Hey, maybe we should consider moving away from that definition and move towards one that sees their responsibilities, holistic development, including athletic development as well, of course. So it's having that real intention to do that. And then more generally, a little bit more detail there is psychosocial life skills, stuff like that. Yes, they do happen implicitly, but a lot of research tells us that for athletes to develop in those ways, it needs to be explicit, meaningful experiences as well. So it needs to be a planned thing. We can't just rely on athletes getting holistic development just from being in a talent development environment, because some things won't happen naturally. Some things need to be explicit, planned, part of that. And then, so second one is kind of that stakeholder alignment and support. again, stakeholders, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, working towards that goal of holistic development. And one of the main things here that came about was kind of this interdisciplinary culture. So instead of those different disciplines, so historically holistic development has been talked a little bit about as kind of as a multidiscipline thing. So an athlete develops in those different disciplines. So that marries up with different disciplines in a TDE. A psychologist looks after the psychology. A physiotherapist looks after the health perspective or whatever it might be. So you can easily say holistic talent development is one that just looks after their disciplines. I think like what we're saying here is actually we need to shift towards interdisciplinary culture. So all the staff in that environment work towards those three different outcomes.
Yeah.
So you see kind of a total overlapping and looping of what those staff try to do. And yes, those staff will be experts and take responsibility for their areas. But we see things like, for example, psychologists going down to cricket net session to feedback about something going on while they are in a pace bowling net session where they're getting bouncers and a psychologist is there. Or an athlete who's working on, for example, their timekeeping skills. That's the thing they've been told they need to work on in their academy. The physiotherapist knows that and they go to their session and they talk to them about it. So we do this kind of constant overlapping of these three different outcomes. That's important because obviously you just get continuity of development. You also get the athletes seeing that the staff value other disciplines as well, which is really important. So you see the athletes see that actually the coaching staff who are here with the S&C and the physio and the psych at a session, they're really valued and they're an important part of my development. So I should pay attention to that as well. So that's, I think, an interesting area as well, really.
What else have we got?
So climate of care, kind of building some stuff there from like Colin Cronum's work around care as well. Really relevant to this. And then really recognising the importance of mental health, kind of promote a positive health perspective here as well about how environment can boost health as well as not just kind of filling up the tank to like a net zero sort of level. It's how can we promote positive health and amplifying the athlete's voice as well, which we kind of talked about a little bit in this podcast so far. And then moving into long-term development, again, something that is a part of all TD research, but really relevant for here, which was particularly goal setting, right? So how does an athlete developing in these different areas over the long term? So typically really technical, tactical, psych focus, fair enough, important to development, but let's have a long-term athlete development plan built into their kind of IDP, PDP stuff that is across holistic development. So across those three domains, let's maybe frame development across these three domains, really sure that athletes are developing across athletic skills, health and well-being, and life readiness across kind of long-term.
Interesting.
Mm.
Anything else?
And then kind of number 5 is that sort of appropriate challenge. And this is a complex one because athletes need to experience stretch in their environment to make progress. But that stretch can be difficult and can be challenging for everyone in that environment and can be really difficult for athletes. So it's how do we get that right? So providing early coping skills, so kind of delivering psychosocial development early in the environment. So when athletes get to a point where they need to be challenged, they're ready to deal with that. And really ensuring that is an individualized and timely sort of process. So the support that an athlete gets and the challenge that an athlete gets is personalized, specific to them. Like moving away from today's going to be a really difficult session. We're going to beast all of you. You know, to certain athletes need to tweak. We need to up, down certain challenge for certain athletes. And that athlete might need that sort of a level of support in different ways at different times as well. And then the final thing is that integrating life skill development, which needs to be kind of an explicit thing really in supporting transfer as well. Like, yes, there'll be a lot of life lessons, a lot of stuff that an athlete will take out of that talent development environment long term. And then there's some research on that as well, that athletes over a period of time after they left their environment realize actually they learned loads of stuff from their life that benefited them from that program. But for that to be really optimal and controlled, that needs to be purposeful, explicit, and there needs to be an element of supporting transfer as well. So how do I link in that program their life outside of sport and the TDE too? So what are some of the things in that program we're doing that explicitly link and support transfer into other aspects of their life, for example?
Really, really interesting, really helpful. It's such a helpful map, this, of holistic development. So number one, a holistic philosophy of athlete development. As you say, if you don't adopt the philosophy in the first place, it's actually difficult to implement anything at all. Number two, stakeholder alignment and support, that feeling of all in. Number three, a climate of care. We've spoken to Colin on the Sports Psych show before about care in sport, care as a coach. Number four, a long-term learning and development focus. Number five, appropriate challenge. And the way to implement that challenge. And number six, integrated life skill development. It feels like this is a map, a plan that almost feels like a turnkey solution. It feels like something you can take and put into any talent development pathway.
I think there's some useful guidelines here that can shape practice. Of course, they are not the only ones.
No.
And they are not going to solve problems, and they'll need contextual sort of richness to them to make sense. But they're a good starting point for us, I think, to start talking about holistic development and what that might mean, and moving that conversation on, I think. But yeah, they need to be applied with context. They need to. How does this look in my environment? What does it mean to integrate life skill development in our program? What are some of the challenges that we have? What are some of the context things that go on in our environment that mean that can make sense better? That obviously needs to be considered, really. But it's a good starting point, and this is kind of the first part of the project. Really, we've got a report to release on this, more detailed, that gives a lot more information around kind of the practical examples, the reason behind these sort of areas, and then there'll be some research hopefully coming out in the next months, years, that we're working on as well on this topic too.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to talking with you again on the Sports Psych show to discuss whatever developments you've had in that research.
Thanks, Dan. I look forward to it again.
Brilliant. Well, Barney, I can't thank you enough for this. It's been really, really, really interesting. And I think all of this is so applicable. As you say, there requires a bit of work to implement these within any kind of talent development pathway. But it does, to me, feel like a really good map, and it's absolutely fantastic work. So thank you for sharing this with us. For those listening in, I know you will have tapped the interest of coaches and people involved in sport who have been listening in. How can people view your work? How can people follow you and get in contact with you if you'd like to be contacted?
Yeah, so I come on Twitter, LinkedIn, that sort of thing. Happy to have conversations there.
What's your handles on Twitter?
So Twitter, LinkedIn, I think I'm B Megicks is my handle for that. And then the paper, you can just kind of Google, find the name of the paper. My email's on there as well. So that's the paper's open access too. So anyone interested in reading it can get their hands on it. Also, like the more project stuff. So the executive summary that we just talked through there, with the different 6 principles, all comes through ICOACHKIDS as well, which you can find online, the website, YouTube, all social medias and stuff that we also put some of our work throughout that way as well.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Barney, can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Yeah, Dan, it's been great to talk. Thank you very much for having on. It's been great.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.